Last week we were talking about our goal was to delve in a little bit more to each one of the five major religions, and we made it through a couple of them last week. And so we talked some about Hinduism, we talked some about Buddhism, and I thought I would start by clarifying a couple things I did through some of the explanation last week and questions that were asked. I realized I probably need to do a little bit better job covering the concept of what basically the Hindu view of the afterlife, and really what it comes down to. Last week I talked about Buddhism. Their goal is to enter into nirvana, which is the cessation of ultimately the cessation of self, and or the end of suffering, because life is suffering. So if you can end all suffering, you just kind of essentially cease to be. And Hinduism is a little bit more complex than that, and I wanted to be a little bit more specific with that. So Hinduism, their concept really can be broken into two different, ultimately very, very different from one another in some senses, end states. And the one is to be absorbed into, I know we're jumping right back into this, but the one is to be absorbed into what the concept that they call Brahman, which is the ultimate reality. Brahman is the God-like figure in Hinduism, especially in Hindu philosophy, and that is the viewpoint that's more closely identified with what Buddhism believes, because you're getting absorbed back into the God himself, so to speak, and so you are ceasing to exist as an independent being, but you still do exist as part of the whole. And that's where the illustration of a drop getting back into the ocean comes from with regards to Hinduism. But then there is another side of Hinduism that does view the eternal state of the soul as a personal dwelling place in the presence of a personal deity. And so we talked about, mentioned last week, Hinduism is a faith system of many, 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 many gods. And yet there's some that are the primary gods. And so what the practicing Hindu oftentimes will have is one god that they are in particular worshiping of the main gods. And their goal is, through the process of reincarnation, ultimately to be absorbed back into that God, but it's more of, in their view, more of a personal, joyful existence absorbed into that deity. And so it's a little bit different probably than the way I said it last week, so I wanted to clarify some of that. And then Katie asked a question at the end last week, if you remember, about radical Hindus. There is a lot. We know, obviously, missionaries to India here in our church, and they have experienced many of them. Some of them have certainly experienced the oppression that has come towards Christians. In some parts of India, there are anti-conversion laws, so it is illegal to convert from Hinduism to another faith system, Christianity. There's things that are part of their culture that certainly make Christianity not favored, or any other religion in a sense. But to answer your question specifically, Katie, from all the digging that I was able to do, technically it's not in classical Hindu teachings. It's supposed to be a peaceful religion, but over time it has developed. There is a concept in Hinduism. Let me find it in my notes. I put it in here so I could come back to it. But there is a concept in Hinduism that is basically their concept of, I guess, I don't know how to pronounce it exactly, but dharma, or righteous duty. And under the concept of righteous duty, or doing what is necessary, there is a school of thought that has enabled some within the Hindu culture that are currently the ones that are more predominant to rise up and say, well, we have to protect the Hindu culture. It's the right thing to do. And so it's almost a political movement that has led to some of the political movement taking the Hindu faith to a nationalistic application, and that has led to the radical Hindus that will oppress and attack and do all kinds. I've heard of very, very, very many atrocious things that Hindus have done. And so there's some of that, but there's some even in their backlog with some of the concepts of what is permissible as violent action to say, well, you're infringing on us, and so there's an excusable level of attack back. And so it's almost slightly inherent in some of their viewpoints have taken to maybe an extreme, which obviously some have. So that's a little bit of a catch up on some of the stuff we talked about last week. But are there any questions that came to your mind after we talked last week about Hinduism, about Buddhism, that you'd like us to talk about a little bit more specifically before we dive into Muslims and Islam? All right, very good. Well, we'll move forward then, and I want to talk to you tonight about Islam and try to give you a little bit of a grasp of these things, because remember, the goal here is not just to have comparative religions, and I didn't expect necessarily even to take this much time on it, but I just felt like after we got into it that it would be an appropriate thing for us to do in this topic that we're in, of talking about current issues and the things that you're going to run into, because no doubt you're going to run into people that believe these things. If you're not up to, you don't follow stuff like that, a Muslim was elected to be the mayor of New York City yesterday, and so there's Muslims are very common in our country today, and so you're going to bump into Islam, and having a right understanding of it, to know how to interact, how to reach them with the gospel ultimately is the goal, but just to know how to even counter some of the ideologies that would come from that is an important thing as well. And so I want to talk to you about Islam tonight, and we'll try to get through this and then get into Judaism as well. And so I want you to understand Islam. We'll get to these five, or it didn't go. I tried to click, but it didn't. These five pillars here in just a second, but a brief history of Islam is, and this is very brief and very basic, but Muhammad is obviously the prophet that's associated with Islam. It was, let me ask this question. Does anybody have any idea when the Islamic faith started? 600s. AD. So very close. So it was. I thought it'd be helpful to just kind of get you thinking on that before I just kind of said it, because sometimes we, just like the Hindu faith and others, sometimes we have no idea, like, when did this come to pass? Like, what was going on in the world? Where is this actually set? And it just sometimes can be helpful just to begin to put pieces together, like a few years ago, and this is maybe to my discredit, or maybe you all wouldn't know either. I heard some things mentioned about Napoleon Dynamite, and I thought, you know what? I have no idea, not one clue when Napoleon, now I know, but when Napoleon lived and was the emperor of France and did all the things that he did. Now, I'm not going to ask how many of you actually know, because maybe it's an obscure fact. I don't know, but maybe everybody's like, well, I learned that when I was in first grade. And so, but then when I began to learn some more about him and to get to put that in perspective, it helped me to see when all of those things did. And the same thing can be true with this. So, Islam. Muhammad was born in 570, and so obviously then his life would be after that, and so that would be when the Islamic faith would come to pass. His father died before his birth, and his mother died when he was 6. He traveled with his uncle and became a lucrative, wealthy merchant. One of the people he worked for, and this is a broad overview, a 40-year-old widow, proposed to him when he was 25 years old. So he was a 25-year-old man, got married to an older lady. All right, at one point, be all right? So,
wrong pipe.
This is a touching story. That's really what it was. So one day, while he was in caves outside of Mecca, the report is that he had a vision, and the vision was that he was visited by the angel Gabriel. The angel Gabriel told him to read this thing that he had there, and he couldn't because he couldn't read. And then when he went back home, it was basically his wife that convinced him that God was telling him that he had chosen him to be a prophet, and he began to dig into the things that he had come to believe, and started what eventually became fully developed as the Islamic faith. The Quran came through all of that, and so that is where it started. A little bit of a germ of how it started. What they would do is they would attack caravans that would go by, and they would take the things from them, rich merchants in the area, and that led to wars between the followers of Muhammad and the merchants and the cities in the area, and eventually Muhammad conquered Mecca in 630 A.D. And from the early, so you can see from even just a little bit of information, there's obviously way more information to give on that little bit of time. From the earliest days of Islam, Islam was a faith system that was predisposed to violence. It was literally part of their founding, and now their justification would be that they were defending themselves from people that were oppressing them, and that is a concept we're going to get into, trying to define what jihad is, because obviously that's a word that we hear thrown around, and we watch the news, hear things maybe, and you kind of don't necessarily always know where it all fits. But so Islam, that's how it started. He had a vision. He believed God was choosing him to be a prophet. They began to try to spread that and teach that, and they would, because they didn't have a lot, they would raid caravans around. People attacked them, and they became the dominant force in the area that they were in around Mecca, and so that's the basic idea of where it came from. Now, what does Islam actually mean? Does anybody know what the word Islam means? Submit, right? So submit to God is ultimately what the overall concept of what Islam is trying. You are to submit to God. That is the right relationship that you're to have to God. The name for God that they use is Allah, and so that is not necessarily probably news to any of us. Muhammad believed that he was restoring the faith that God, Allah, had initially communicated, but had been perverted by Jews and by Christians, and so he believed that the Bible was at one level was a good book, but had been corrupted by people over time. They'd added to it the things the Jews had added, Christians had added to the Bible, so that it said what they wanted it to say to support their belief system. And so the entire premise of Islam was this is a correction back to the right faith. And so no, it wasn't actually supposed to be Jacob. It was supposed to be Ishmael, and so they are descendants of from Ishmael, obviously Abraham's other son, and so that's where that is the storyline that they teach within the teachings of Islam. And so he was saying, okay, we are trying to take back and straighten out the record of what this is supposed to be. Now, you could imagine that would take an entire, that would mean there need to be an entire reinterpretation of all of history from Abraham's time to now, and that's exactly what they do, and that's exactly the idea behind Islam is trying to ultimately that would flip our entire paradigm for viewing the world in which we live, because we live in a world in Western civilization that has been highly influenced by the interpretation on the Bible that we have. And so if you're trying to say, well, that's all actually skewed and wrong, and you have to put this in its place, that is why it is very difficult for the practices when it comes to a governmental sense of Islam to be something that mesh in a place like we are in, because their foundation is opposed to one another ultimately, and so that getting a little bit far afield, but so Islam believes the Bible is tainted, and the Quran is there to teach truthfully. Muhammad was the prophet that God had chosen to instill the right teachings. And so the 5 pillars of Islam, if you've ever heard that term before, I've got them listed in very brief terms for you to look at here this evening. So the 5 pillars of Islam. The first one is the declaration of faith. These are means of receiving grace from Allah. The declaration of faith is to consistently declare there is no God but Allah and Muhammad his prophet. That you've probably heard that statement. Maybe you watch a movie or something, they say something like that. But that is one of the things that they are supposed to do on a regular basis, to declare their faith. It's not just something that somewhere way back then, like we call a profession of faith when somebody accepts Jesus as their Savior. The declaration of faith in Islam is not just like, back when I was 13 years old, I made the declaration of faith. This is something that they are to repeat over and over again. Ritual prayer, 5 times a day, no matter where they are. And how many of you have ever been somewhere before where you've seen a Muslim get down and pray? Anybody ever seen that before? So I remember, I've seen it many times, but I remember very vividly. I was talking on the phone to Becca one time, and I was in my car. I was at a rest stop, and I was sitting there about to get back on the road, and there gets the guy. This guy comes out of, I think, gets out of his car, came out of the rest stop at one of those real nice ones on one of those toll roads, and it comes out, gets in the grass, puts the whatever they call that thing, just a rug, carpet, whatever. Prayer mat. There we go. I knew something more sophisticated than what I was thinking, but prayer mat on the ground, and kneels down on it, prays, and it was just right there in the middle of people walking all around, and so they are to pray wherever they are at these set times. Alms giving, 2.5% of their annual income is given to needy Muslims. Fast during the month of Ramadan. And a pilgrimage once in their lifetime to Mecca and during the last month of the year. So these are the 5 pillars of Islam. These are the things they're supposed to do. But it's important for us to realize that these are things that are to be done to receive grace from Allah. Now, your only hope of eternity, this is a very much a simplification in the Islamic faith, is obedience to these 5 pillars and mercy from Allah. Like, you could do all of these things ritualistically, religiously, devotedly, and you're not really ever sure it's enough until you die and you find out. It's very much a works-based faith system still, and so these are the 5 pillars. These are the things that Muslims would say, and there's a lot of obviously things that need to be said to clarify, elaborate, to broaden those things out. This is just a little bit of an overview. So I wanted to talk for just a second on jihad and the root of radical Islam for just a moment. So we have a little bit better picture. Not every not every Muslim is somebody that's just looking to kill you, okay? That is, I know that everybody knows that already, but there's no doubt that because of things that have happened in our country, 9/11, when that happened, there was certainly an uptick in everybody was maybe a little bit on edge as to every Muslim is somebody that's just a jihadi that wants everybody dead. And now, while their faith system certainly is predisposed to that, I just want you to understand that there are kind and wonderful people that are Muslims. They just need to be saved, and they need to get out of the faith system that would point them in a direction that certainly is predisposed to that mindset and to that teaching. But it is important for us to realize that, because, like I've said with some other things, you got to have a focus on reaching people, and you can't just be like, wow, you're just blow somebody off or fly off the handle because you find out they're a Muslim or not know how to deal with them. There's just a lot of different things that could be said there. But what is jihad? Well, jihad simply means striving or to strive or to struggle, right? So that is the concept behind what it actually means. So jihad has a few different manifestations within the mindset of the Muslim faith. One is the internal struggle to just have moral self-discipline, and so just living right, doing right by their code of ethics and in honor in their culture. And so there's a lot of things within their practice that would lead to a moral lifestyle in some respects, and then then also the social struggle, which is helping the poor or resisting oppression. And then the final one, armed struggle or fighting to protect and spread Islam, are both appropriate applications of the concept of jihad to the struggle of the Muslim faith to protect. It's really where if you follow some of their teachings, they would say that's where it started. They justified violence in order to protect their faith system, and that's you look all the way back to the beginning, and that's what they say, that's all that Muhammad was doing, was all self-defense, so to speak. But it didn't take very long for that faith system that gave a permission to violence to go beyond that, even if it did. And I doubt from some of the study that I've done that that's actually the case. But even if it did start in innocence, so to speak, it didn't take very long for them to go beyond that to say, actually, because what we want to do is protect the true and right way of doing things, it is not just acceptable, it is desirable to go on the war path to spread the true way of thinking. And that's what, when we think of jihad today, we think of a holy war. That's what we would commonly say, that's what jihad even means. And they are on a path of striving to spread the faith and the conditions in which the Islamic faith can prosper. And so that's where you get, and you look into Muslim countries where this is the predominant religion, or you look back in the past 100 years, and you can see lots of different manifestations of this popping up. As a matter of fact, during World War I, the concept of jihad was one of the driving factors in what led the British Empire to deal with the Turks and the Ottomans in the way that they did to try to get them to. They were afraid that all of the Arab world was going to rise up in jihad against them. And so there were some things that were done during that period of time. And from then to now, there's been just a massive, massive uptick in even just the concept of what jihad means. So it's gone from originally being something probably that needed the endorsement of the religious establishment to being something that can be practiced personally today, where you can be a participant in this armed struggle as an individual, just wherever you are, resisting the oppression that's coming down on Muslims in whatever place, in whatever way they are being oppressed, to the extent of violence. That's trying to give a less of a just very basic idea of what the concept of jihad is. But I thought I'd try to give a little bit more than just like, well, it's a holy war and they think it's okay to hurt you in order to spread their faith. Because it is a pretty complex thing, and I wanted to help you understand. And now, is there any questions about that or any thoughts that anybody would like to add in right there before we move on? Because I may have lost you, but if I didn't, great. So, very good. Okay, well, I do want to spend a little bit of time, and that's a very light way to look at Islam, but that is all we're going to get a chance to do is if we're going to make it through a little bit more tonight. So, next, Judaism. What is Judaism? How do we understand today? How do we understand the Old Testament? And know where all of this fits? Because Christianity obviously has a shared heritage with the people that practice Judaism today, and yet we are very, very different from them, obviously. How did that come to pass? How do Jews today, why do Jews today practice what they practice as opposed to Old Testament teachings, you look at Judaism today, does it look anything like what's talked about in the Old Testament? No, right? Now, who can tell me one of the biggest reasons why? See if we can come up with it. Let's give a guess. What's your guess as the biggest reason why Judaism today doesn't look like the practice in the Old Testament?
Temple's not there.
There's no temple, right? And for a little while, there was no Jerusalem either. And that really, historically speaking, is a very, very big thing to understand as to understanding the shift in Judaism. When the Jews were not in Jerusalem, when the temple was destroyed, and that happened obviously a couple times when whatever year it was, whatever it was BC, when the Babylonians came and they took the Jews out of Jerusalem and took them into Babylon for 70 years, so they destroyed the temple. And when they were there in Babylon, they came up with a way of perpetuating their faith, and that was really the beginning of the time when scribes and rabbis were that was kind of when that became established. But then you take that out 400 more years, and there was pockets of Israelites scattered across the region at that point, and the synagogues and rabbis became more and more and more popular up until Jesus' day, where rabbis, teachers were a regular fixture in the religious teaching establishment. But then, when the temple and Jerusalem were destroyed in 70 A.D., then they had to totally shift their paradigm. Because they weren't rebuilding this time, right? This was kind of the end of that moment for them. And when that happened, they reprogrammed the way that we don't have priests anymore, we don't have a temple anymore, we can't have sacrifices anymore, so what are we going to do? And that is something that is a question that needs to be answered, but that is ultimately, historically, that's what shifted the Old Testament practice of our Old Testament faith of the Israelites into the new millennium, obviously after Jesus was crucified. And what it became was because they were trying to, how do we follow the law without the temple? How do we follow the law without sacrifices? What are we supposed to do? How does the law apply to our nation today? Now, if you're going to understand the Jews, one of the most important things you have to do is understand who they are as a people. And that's why I put this up here for you for just a moment. Judaism is a faith system that is connected with the nation of Israel. The nation of Israel, they are the covenant people. These are the covenants that I would want you to be familiar with. I will not certainly delve into what all of them are tonight, but just to mention, the Abrahamic covenant was obviously what was given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 and elaborated in chapter 15 and chapter 17, where God promised to Abraham that there would be land. There's going to be a seed that would come, the more than the stars. That you can't count them. The seed, and God said, and through you, all nations of the earth will be blessed. Right. So land, seed, and blessing. God promised to Abraham. The Abrahamic covenant was unconditional. It means the Jews, the descendants of Abraham, that were the ones that were to receive this promise. This was going to be true of them regardless of their performance. Conditions, right? Conditions are like, hey, if you do this, I'll do this, right? Maddie said to us yesterday that if we beat her, she wouldn't make pretzels. Is that how it said? Or if we,
She won. She would not.
But
She lost.
if she lost, but she still made pretzels. But she won one of the games. So, right, conditions. An unconditional covenant, God said, I am going to make this covenant with you. And when the way the Bible puts it, when he could swear by none greater, he swore by himself. God based his fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant with the people of Israel on his own integrity. Therefore, it's never going to change, right? It's unconditional. It's also eternal in that regard because he made that an element of the promise. This is the way it's going to be. So the Abrahamic covenant. Then the Mosaic covenant is centered on the law and on national holiness. There are conditions to be met in the Mosaic covenant. They were to perform. Now, they were part of the recipients of it, but there was curses, there were blessings that were part of the Mosaic covenant, and individuals within the covenant could be recipients of the blessing or recipients of the curse, as could the nation. But this was a covenant that was made, obviously, when God gave the law in Exodus chapter 19 and 20 and through 24, specifically with the Ten Commandments. You've got the Mosaic covenant. The next one, the Davidic covenant, God told David, ultimately, that there's going to be an eternal throne. It's going to be sat on by someone from the line of David. And that also implies an eternal kingdom that God is going to have with David's descendant sitting on that throne. And God said, eternal. If it's eternal, how long does it have to last? Forever, right? So there's a lot of people that today will believe maybe in something. If you've ever heard of replacement theology, a replacement theology is where the church has replaced Israel in the fulfillment of God's promises. And there's a lot of reasons why that does not work. But one of the big reasons why that does not work is there's no way to fulfill an eternal promise to a nation when you take the nation out of the equation. It was not eternal if that is the case. Now, the way that people will avoid that is, well, Jesus is the head of the church, and so he is sitting on the throne of that kingdom, so to speak. And so we'll get into that some other time. But the Davidic covenant, then the new covenant, is the covenant given to God's people, once again, with condition that they would be able to have forgiveness, have a new heart placed in them, have the indwelling of the Holy Spirit. The new covenant is the one that really brings Jews and Gentiles together in the relationship that we have with God. And so these are the covenants, though, that were given specifically and first to the Jewish people. So they are the covenant people. And then and I mentioned these things a second ago, or some of this. So the rabbi concept within Judaism that we would see today, these are the teachers that teach in synagogues that tell people what they're to do. But what happened to go back to what I was saying a few minutes ago, what happened when the temple was destroyed and all of that, they obviously had the Old Testament, but then they came up with what ultimately is what they have the Talmud is trying to, the words kind of get mixed up in mind, but the Talmud is a collection of writings by the early rabbis in the Jewish faith after the destruction of the temple up until about 500 AD. And these writings are the foundations for how they say, okay, this is how you practice Judaism today. And they gave interpretations to the law to say, okay, and this is where, if you've ever heard, how many of you have ever heard anything about Jews where they're not allowed to light a fire on Sabbath? Anybody ever heard that before? That would come from the Talmud. You're not allowed to create something like that. And so there's a lot of things about the laws about things that are kosher and okay, how do you apply that law to the dietary laws and things in a modern time? And so they had those early rabbis, but rabbis even still today, what they do is they try to interpret the Old Testament, interpret the writings of the early rabbis, and bring them into today. And they're more or less providing commentary today on how to fulfill that. And but that all comes down to fulfilling. There's 619 laws communicated in the Old Testament, and they've tried to say, okay, this is how this law is to be fulfilled. But it's not like we look at the Old Testament and say, well, there's principles here that we're supposed to follow. Some of these things aren't things that are practiced today because they were fulfilled in Jesus Christ. It is still the law. You do this to earn merit with God. It is a works-based approach to faith. If those two terms even really can reside together. And so you have to fulfill these things to be right with God. And so Jews are trying to fulfill the interpretation of 619 laws applied to modern times, and that's what's led to all of the things that Jews would do even still today. Is regards to they don't walk, they don't use electronics on the Sabbath day. They've got to walk to, if they're an Orthodox Jew, they got to walk to synagogue. They can't turn their TV on Sundays because it's electricity. And, I mean, there's lots of little laws like that, and it's not even acceptable to leave your TV on Friday night and truthfully and let it be on Saturday. I mean, there's a lot of things that they have that are the application of the law as far as they can understand how it would be. So that's a lot of information. Just like last week, I know I just kind of opened up and dumped it on you, but is there any thoughts or questions before we wrap up for tonight? Just know this: the longer we talk in here, the less work you have to do out there when you walk out that door. So, questions?
So does Judaism believe in salvation?
Not like we do. They don't believe in Jesus, and so they would believe in being righteous before God by their works. So they're like still sinners? yes, yeah. So yeah. They don't have a concept of getting their sins atoned for because they don't have the sacrificial system anymore, and so they've got to perform these works and these laws, and they do different things during the feasts where sacrifices would have been mentioned or done in their place, and that's supposed to kind of take the place of it, but that comes from the reinterpretation of the law that's been given out by the rabbis. Yeah. Temporary atonement is still the order of the day within Judaism, just like it has always ultimately been. So, okay.
I've never really understood how. Maybe this is too in depth for what we're doing right now, but Judaism as a religion versus ethnicity,
Yeah.
and with secularist Jews being probably the largest amount of Jews today.
Yeah.
How does that identity work? You know what I'm saying? Like, how does Jewish versus Israelite, they're kind of all the same thing, but there's such a difference between the Orthodox Jews and the secular Jews and
Well, yes.
Hebrews and, you know.
Yeah, so I think one important thing to recognize is that the Judaism as a faith system is wrong. So whether they identify with Judaism or they're just a Jew, it almost doesn't matter, because it's like one a secular Jew might actually be more likely to get saved than a religious one, because they are just ethnically, they are Jewish. So as it comes down to the way that I would believe that you'd have to apply the principle of how to view a Jewish person, ethnically is more important than the religious identification of a Jewish person, because they are an ethnic group of people that God has chosen. It's not just the religious establishment that God has chosen. And so when you're looking at today, you've got the Jewish nation and all of that, you'd have to process it through that. So then the fulfillment of those promises through the covenants that God's made are ultimately going to be visited on the ethnic Jews, not just people that were proselytes into Judaism. And then the reality is the new covenant is an extension to them and to us, Jews and Gentiles. Paul's desire was that the Jews would be saved, right? We're supposed to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The only way for a Jew to be at peace is the only way for anybody to be at peace, to have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. And so the ultimate reality is that we are all need to be in Christ, and the Jews are going to come to in the tribulation. There's going to be a massive turning of Jewish people to Jesus at that point. But again, once Jesus comes up to set up his throne, physically speaking, there will be a restoration of the Jewish nation, that Jesus sits on the throne of David as he rules and reigns over this earth, and so ethnically as opposed to religiously and politically even, there'd be some differentiation, but the covenants would be visited on the ethnic aspect of that, would be how I think that you'd have to apply that, so.
You can be born of Israeli bloodline, be Jewish.
That's kind of what I'm wondering. Like, is
Yeah.
it still like in the Old Testament it was the Hebrews were
Yeah.
the Jewish people? Is that pretty much still?
The hard thing, yes and no. I mean, obviously there were people that were accepted into, Rahab is a great example of someone that was not originally Jewish, but Jesus comes through her bloodline. And so there was I don't know how that will work out in the end. Nor do I don't even truthfully know how they do that today. Jews are not very evangelistic. They're not anti, proselytization where people can become Jews, but they're not looking for that because they want to protect their ethnic identity as well. And so it's I'm not really sure how that really plays out today. But I mentioned on Sunday, Caleb in the Bible is not historically was not a Jew by full blood. The Kenizzites were a tribe of people in Canaan before Abraham ever got there, and so that's what Caleb was as well. But they chose to identify in. But then what would have happened in those days is they chose to accept Jehovah God during the Old Testament practice of faith, and then they intermarried into the nation, and so that was acceptable in that regard. And so choosing to accept Judaism as a faith system today and then marrying a Jew would be very different than what happened in the Old Testament days. So. Any other questions or thoughts? Hannah?
I know their school is a little bit different because they only go half a day Friday but they pick it up back on Sunday to complete it because and from what I watch a lady on Facebook who is an Orthodox Jew that lives in New York. And so basically anything and everything they get, they have to take to the mikvah because it is not safe for kosher to make kosher food.
Yeah. So there's a lot of little things, about their practices that can get a little bit hard to follow sometimes. But if you dig into it, there's a lot of people that are very devoted. So, any other questions or thoughts? I'm here if you need me afterwards. I told you last week that I was working on it, and so just to give you an update, if you go and look up Pursuit Ministries on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, you'll begin to find the lessons for in here from the Sunday school class that I teach. They'll be labeled as such. So Yabs or Endeavor. Underneath that, Pursuit Ministries, BRBC, Young Adults. It's a bluish background with a gold mountain on it. And so there's another one on Apple that is similarly named. And so I just want you to find the right one. And but follow us, listen when you're not able to be here, or listen after the fact if I really confuse you, and try to figure it out, I guess. But we're glad that you're here tonight. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your attentiveness. Let's get out of here.